Dennis, appreciate you and the YPN and EFC for giving me the space and the floor today. It's greatly appreciated. I also say I think I am officially no longer a YPNer. I turned 41 this week, so I don't know if Corey's going to raise the age limit for me, but I think I'm out of the YPN. But it was a great organization and really helped me solidify my footing in a bunch of relationships within the industry. So thank you to all the YPNers who have joined. And today, as you know, we want to talk about electric vehicles, but more importantly, for our industry, what I think is part of the roadmap to electrification. And I want to start the presentation not about the future of transportation, but really about the past with transportation, because this is not our society's first generational environmental transportation crisis. For anyone who knows this story, it was 1894. The London Times dubbed this the Great Manure Crisis. And they predicted that in 50 years, every street in London would be buried under 9 feet of horse manure if a problem wasn't found for the issue. And it wasn't just London, it was all major metropolises in the world, because the major transportation at the time system at the time was horse and buggy, or horse-drawn carriage. And despite fierce debates among urban planners and various studies into the matter, no solution to that specific problem was ever found. It was a disruptive technology that solved the problem for them. It was Henry Ford, it was Carl Benz, it was Daimler, and others who introduced motorized vehicles at a massive scale. And it wasn't the first time a better technology saved an industry. It won't be the last time. And I would make the argument that the exact same thing is happening today with our global transportation system. For anyone who knows this vehicle, this is the Tesla Model S Plaid. It does 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. It runs a quarter mile in 9.3 seconds. It has a top speed of 320 kilometers an hour. It has a range of over 600 kilometers on a single charge. And you can add, when recharging this vehicle, you can add 200 kilometers of range in 5 minutes. It's incredibly quick. It even has boat mode. If you get stuck in a flash flood, it will let you float for a little bit and hopefully get you out of that situation. This vehicle, for all those performance levels, will cost you roughly $150,000 Canadian. If we want to compare that to its internal combustion counterpart, this would probably be the closest from a strict performance standpoint. It is the Bugatti Chiron. This will cost you $4.7 million to do the exact same thing with a lot of those baseline specs with an internal combustion engine. So that undoubtedly is one driver. The technology itself is driving this shift, regardless of all the other factors that we'll talk about now. Some of the other big market drivers, I think, is just one, the public's appetite for a cleaner environment. If you look at this slide on your left-hand side, these are nitrogen dioxide levels in the troposphere above China. This is pre and post initial COVID lockdown. So these are measured from satellites. Nitrous dioxide is what comes out of exhaust pipes. It's actually one of the worst pollutants for humans. So on the left-hand side, this is January, pre-COVID lockdown. On the right-hand side of this slide, this is post-COVID lockdown, the largest shutdown of any city any country that I'm aware of during COVID. And you can see the incredible reduction in nitrous dioxide levels. And this is now a taste. And we've all now had a taste what a pollutant-free future can look like from a transportation perspective, but more importantly, what a greenhouse gas-free future can look like for all of us. That's one huge driver. I think the next biggest driver for this market shift, and this is, I'm politically agnostic, so love this guy or hate this guy. We as a country at the federal level have made significant commitments under the Paris Agreement to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. I think there's almost 200 countries who have signed on to the Paris Climate Deal. This is a legally binding agreement to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We need to be greenhouse gas free by 2050. We need to be 30% below our 2005 levels by 2030. And if we want to relate this specifically to the presentation today, in Canada, 27% of all of our greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. So within these reduction goals, we now have specific reduction targets for industry sectors. If we look at transportation as a sector, we've made commitments now there. We're saying 10% of all light duty sales, so light duty being what we all drive to work every single day. If we look at that, 10% of light duty sales need to be zero emission by 2025. And now, and this timeline has been bumped up, now we have to be 100% of new vehicles sold in this country by 2035 have to be zero emissions. So how do you reach these goals? Typically, when you're government, there's only a couple ways to move a marketplace. You can either tax the problem or you can incent the solution. Our government has chosen the latter, which is to incent the solution. They've looked at vehicles directly because of the initial costs. Like most industries, when you start to subsidize a technology, you're trying to get the volume up so the economics take over and it naturally drives the cost down. Our government has rebated the vehicles themselves. So at the federal level, you'll see a $5,000 rebate up into a certain price threshold on the vehicle. And you'll see up to $8,000 in some provinces to complement that federal rebate on the vehicles. I don't think vehicle rebates or vehicle incentives is really what's going to drive the market any faster. I think more importantly, and where we're also seeing our government spend money, is on infrastructure. Because you can have the greatest car in the world, which some would argue we just saw on the previous slide, but if your infrastructure is not there to support it, you will kill the adoption faster than any other thing could. So our government has also invested close to $1 billion in zero emission vehicle infrastructure. And we're going to talk about that in more detail as we get into the opportunities for our industry. The next big driver, similar to our Prime Minister, love him or hate him, I'm agnostic on this guy, but you cannot argue what Elon Musk and Tesla have done for electric vehicle adoption now globally. He's built a brand without subsidies, without incentives. He's built a private brand, which is publicly traded, which is now the largest EV manufacturer on the planet. And not just the EVs, which people love. He's also built out the largest fast charging network by a long shot. Over 50,000 fast charging connectors Tesla has now deployed globally. Similarly, without taking money from the governments to do this. And I want to talk, because we still have quite a bit of naysayers that I run into and you may run into here in the electrical industry who don't believe that this technology is the solution. It may go deeper than that. They don't even think there is a problem. But regardless of what you think, I just want to point out some data which is pretty overwhelming on why electric vehicles are here to stay. If you look at any technology adoption by mass market, you can really break it down into, 5 segments. You've got your innovators very, very early on, the ones who innovate the technology. You have your early adopters or your visionaries. The biggest issue with any product adoption is what's referred to as the chasm, how you go from the early adopter stage to the early majority stage, where you start to get, a self-perpetuating product. And that's what most products fail to overcome. And if you're familiar with the Gartner Institute out of the US, they do indexes on different technologies and what the hype versus real world adoption looks like. So if we take what's known as the Gartner hype cycle adoption curve, and we overlay that on the product adoption curve, you get a lot of hype around a technology and a lot of talk about a technology, a lot of interest in the technology before you actually get real world adoption. So you typically go from hype to, okay, this thing never made it to market, to disillusionment. And then maybe it crosses that chasm and you find early to late majority adoption on the product technology. And even for us in our own industry, we've seen this several times, but most recently in my lifetime, in my career in this industry, we saw it with LED technology. LEDs were theorized back in the 20s and 30s. Patents were first laid on LED technologies by GE and a few other major corporations in the US in the 50s. The first high wattage blue LED was developed in the 90s. This is really the base for what all the fixtures and lamps we see today utilize. And it wasn't really till the mid to late 2000s, pushing 2008, 2009, 2010, before it became the de facto standard. So this is what a hype cycle really looks like around a technology. And I want to draw the comparison now to electric vehicles. This was the early 1900s. We're talking the advent of mass transit. And this is the early 1900s. And there was really three dominant technologies at the time. Electric vehicles in the early 1900s. This is the Fritchel electric. I think it got over 100 miles on a single charge. It was electric vehicles, it was steam vehicles, and it was ICE, or internal combustion engines, that each shared about 1/3 of the market share. This is in the early 1900s. Unfortunately, with a primitive electrical grid in North America and very cheap access and availability to oil, the distribution of oil, and ultimately the dispensation of oil, internal combustion engines won the day. So electric vehicles have been around for a very long time. The technology has been around for a very long time, and the hype around that technology has been around for a very long time. If we look at global EV sales, let's go back to the 1900s when electrics represented about 1/3 of all vehicles sold. And this is by the millions. So now let's push this out to 2011, 2012. Last year alone, there was 12.5 million electric vehicles sold. Last quarter, globally, electric vehicles represented 14% of all new vehicles sold. And if we overlay real world sales data on electric vehicles versus that Gartner hype cycle, really the disillusionment trough when people were unsure which way this was really going to go, in my opinion, it peaked in 2012. And I say that for this reason. In 2012, Tesla launched its first mass-produced electric vehicle. It was the Model S. That same year, the Tesla stock was the most shorted stock on the planet. So in 2012, more people were betting on Tesla to fail than they were to succeed. It was the most shorted stock of all time. You push that out to today, 2022, 2023, before the market correction. So before we had that inflation and the market corrected, Tesla was the first $1 trillion, just strictly by market cap. Tesla was the first $1 trillion automotive manufacturer of all time. It was worth more than 4 times its closest rival, which is Toyota. So the market has now spoken. We've passed that chasm, and we are past the early adopters into the early majority of this technology. So it's not going away. It's only getting stronger, and the opportunities that lie within that are massive, and we're going to talk about them. On the technology piece, I think for anyone who is not familiar with an electrified transportation system, the first thing they have to understand is an electrified transportation system is fundamentally different than its internal combustion engine counterparts. This doesn't have to exist. This doesn't need to exist. This shouldn't exist in an electrified transportation system, which is centralized refueling stations within urban areas. You don't want to drive your electric vehicle down to 10%, pull over on your way home, and sit in a lineup waiting for a DC fast charger for 20 minutes only to charge for an hour to make it home 2 hours later. That user experience doesn't make sense. It doesn't need to exist with electrified transportation. This is the way an electrified transportation system works, and this is why the opportunities are so massive. The average Canadian only drives 50 kilometers a day. So that's less than 2 hours of charge time per day on the average home charger, what we call a level 2 charger. We'll look at it here shortly. The difference with internal combustion engines and electrified or electric or zero emission vehicles, specifically electric, is you're constantly topping up. There's a bunch of terms for this. One is ABC, always be charging. You get to work, you top up. You get home, you topped up. You go to the mall, you top up. You come in from Truro, you come in from outside of a city, wherever it may be, and you get to the IKEA, like in this screenshot, and you top up while you're there because you're only driving roughly 50 kilometers a day. You only need a little bit of time on that charger. One, the cost to deploy level 2 charging infrastructure is significantly less. And two, it's also significantly better for the batteries to slow charge them and constantly be topping them up. And if you start to think about how many destinations we have, then you'll start to wrap your head around, specifically for this industry, how many opportunities exist for us to deploy infrastructure as this transportation system gets electrified. Another barrier we always hear, I still hear, is range. People are still conscious and cognizant of the range of these vehicles. There's a term called range anxiety, where you think you're not going to make it, you won't be able to find a charger. These are all very real things. Now the top 10 vehicles in North America all get over 500 kilometers on a single charge. The top vehicle in North America now is the Lucid. It gets almost 850 kilometers on a single charge. And these numbers will only continue to go up as the battery technologies continue to get better and better. So hopefully range is no longer a roadblock for most consumers. Now I want to talk specifically about electric vehicle supply equipment. The acronym is EVSE. This is a pretty common term. Some people say chargers. There's a lot of different terms for them, but EVSE is what we in the industry should always refer to electric vehicle chargers as. So electric vehicle supply equipment. There's three types that are commonly talked about: level 1, level 2, and level 3. Level 3 is no longer called level 3. It's referred to now as direct current fast charging. Level 1, the way I always remember it, is level 1 equals 120 volt. Level 2 equals 240 or 208 volt. Level 3, what is now DCFC, is 3-phase supply power. So level 1, level 2, level 3. Good news for us in the industry, we no longer care about level 1. You saw the range slide earlier. With the top vehicles now getting over 500 kilometers of range, and a 120 volt charger only being able to add 8 kilometers of range per hour, there's no value in them for the most part, and no one in our industry really would stock or sell these. Maybe you'll find them still at some direct to consumer retailers like Amazon. Everything you need to focus on for your product knowledge in this industry: level 2, 208, 240, level 3, 3-phase. The biggest difference between the two, and including level 1, but the biggest difference between the two is level 2 is always AC from the supply source to AC into the vehicle. It relies on what's known as the onboard charge controller, so the OBCC, to convert the AC energy coming from the source to the DC that the batteries are requiring to charge. So that's why the cost is typically so much less on a level 2 charger, because the hardest point of the technology is being built into the vehicles themselves. So level 1, level 2 is always AC into the vehicle, relies on the battery charge controller to convert the AC to DC. Level 3 is very different. It's DC. So it converts the AC from the supply source to DC within the EVSE itself, within the electric vehicle supply equipment. So it's converting it to DC, and it's delivering it to the vehicle as DC. So it's straight to the battery management system, as opposed to having to go through that onboard charge controller. And the big value in this is the amount of energy you can deliver directly to the battery's architecture. We're talking up to 500 amps and higher now on some of these liquid cooled cables. And Tesla, for example, with their new vehicle and their new Type 4 chargers, you can add 200 kilometers of range in about 5 minutes. And hopefully this is now one of the last roadblocks to adoption for most people, which is the speed, the time to recharge. If you're in a scenario where you're not going to make it to your destination, you're between two destinations, it's off highway, you want to charge quickly, these are some incredible charge times. The other technology piece that we unfortunately have to have some understanding of in North America is connector types, because unlike the EU and other nations who have standardized and forced manufacturers to use one type of connector for all vehicles, here in North America, we had Tesla very early on who developed their own standard. So Tesla developed the NACS connector. You see it here on the level 1 charging portion, you see it on the level 2 charging portion, and you see it in DC FC charging. So the NACS connector that Tesla developed is a single connector for all charging types. It was owned by them and only licensable up until recently. So no manufacturers wanted to pay those licensing fees to Tesla. So the rest of the North American automotive market worked with the SAE, the Society of Automotive Engineers, and they came up with their own connector for AC. So on level 1, level 2, they use J1772 or J1772. And then on the fast charging side for non-Tesla vehicles, we see 2 types still. One is pretty much gone. We see CHAdeMO, which was the original fast charging standard. It was a Japanese standard, and the Nissan Leafs were one of the original all-electric vehicles in North America. So we did see infrastructure deployed with CHAdeMO. But the rest of the industry in North America standardized on CCS, and even Nissan and the Japanese manufacturers have now moved to CCS. So these are the connector options we see. This looks like it's changing again with Tesla opening up their NACS connector. We've seen quite a few automotive manufacturers, including some of the big ones like Ford, announce they'll be switching their vehicles over next year to the NACS connector, which is a great connector. And it does make your life easier when it's one connector for all levels of charging. The good news is for Tesla owners, forever, including right now, except for a few pilot sites, non-Tesla owners can only use non-Tesla chargers. But Tesla owners could use all the Tesla charging stations, and then they could just buy an adapter for everyone else's charging station. So that's why Tesla has won so much market share, in my opinion, early, because their infrastructure is so robust and they get the redundancy of the non-Tesla charging stations as well. The last charging technology, which is still being ratified and finalized, which is incredibly interesting, everything I've talked about to this point has been based on light duty vehicles. So what we all drive, as I mentioned, what you drove to work potentially today, or what you own as an individual, as a consumer, those are all light duty vehicles. The other side of our transportation system is medium duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles. And just looking at this screen here, you can see the size of the vehicles we're starting to talk about, even on the medium duty side, and then heavy duty, definitely on the equipment side. They need even more energy. So the standard that's being ratified right now is called the megawatt charging system. Tesla has started shipping their semi truck, the Tesla Semi. I think Pepsi was the original contract, and Pepsi, has taken delivery of some of those Tesla semi trucks. Tesla has gone with 1 megawatt charging for their medium and heavy duty vehicles. The industry is looking to ratify a 3.7 megawatt standard. And to put that in perspective, the fastest charging vehicle on the road right now, the vehicle that can take the most energy, it uses a 900 volt DC architecture as opposed to Tesla, which only uses 400, is the Lucid Air. That vehicle can take about 300 kilowatts of energy. So light duty vehicles, the max we see is 300 kilowatts. With this new megawatt charging system, we're going to see 3.7 megawatts on a single connector. The other piece of technology that I think you really need to understand if you want to dive a bit deeper into this space as a professional is the technology that the hardware uses to communicate with software. Because home chargers are pretty basic. You could really just have a plug and play version where you never worry about interfacing to a technology or a software platform. But as soon as you get into commercial charging, most people want a way to monetize that energy. So to bill users for the energy that's going into their vehicle. They want a way to control access to those vehicles. They want a way to do things like load balance and shed energy and play in utility programs. And the technology that the industry, or the protocol the industry has standardized on, is OCPP. It stands for Open Charge Point Protocol. It's a JSON standard, which means it's a language that can talk to computers. I could get very technical with all of the protocols within that OCPP standard, but I don't think that's the relevant point to the technology. I think this woman's story summarizes the issue the industry as a whole right now is having. This woman's name is Pauline Richards. She wrote a letter to, it was an open letter to Electric Autonomy Canada, and she wanted to share her experience as an EV driver. She had just gone out, she had retired, she lives in Waterloo, Ontario. She had gone out, bought her first all-electric vehicle. This is the Chevy Bolt. Was incredibly excited, always wanted to be an early adopter, and it was very, important to her to be an adopter from an environmental perspective. Bought this EV and was ready to make a trip from Waterloo, Ontario to St. John, New Brunswick, called her local Chevy dealership and said, hey, I've never owned an electric. What do I need to know about this journey? They said, okay, probably you just need to download the Flow app. They weren't too educated, but they said probably you just need to download the Flow app. And really, you should be good to use their charging network. They're quite ubiquitous. They've got good coverage across Canada. She thought, perfect. I'll go to my local Flow charging station before I leave, just to make sure that I understand the process. So she goes to the closest Flow charging station, downloads the app, preloads $50 onto the app, tries to start the session. Admittedly, she's not that technologically inclined, but couldn't get the session started. So she calls Flow. She said Flow is great, incredible tech support. They said, look, it may be easier for you to order one of our ID cards, and that way the transactions will be easier. Orders the card. Unfortunately, it doesn't show up before she leaves for her trip. So she starts on her journey with her partner. They make their first stop off the 401. It's an en route station. Pull up to the charger, pull out the Flow app, couldn't get it to work. Calls the number on the charger. It turns out it's not a Flow charger, it's an IV charger. So IV, as an operator, tells her, hey, you have to download our app. Hey, you have to put money onto our app, and now you can start your charging session. So downloads her second app, preloads money, continues on, gets in Quebec, home of Flow, perfect. Unfortunately, when she goes to charge at the first station, it's not operated by Flow. It's operated by another provider called Circuit Electric. Does the same thing, new app, more money, gets to New Brunswick, another Flow charger, run by Add Energy. She could have used her Flow app, didn't know, downloads the Add Energy app, adds more money to her card, gets to St. John, turns around, has to find another charging station that wasn't the 3 she used previously in ChargePoint. And she got home to Waterloo after this experience, and she wrote this letter saying, you'll never get mass adoption if this is the way the technology operates. And right now, with this standard, we are seeing it being used similar to how Bell, or with this protocol, how Bell, Rogers, and TELUS used to operate their cell phones. If you remember this, I know this is the YPN or a YPN session, but if you remember Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, if you bought a phone from them, even though it was an iPhone, even though they use the same technology to communicate on the network, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS used to lock the phone to the network. So if you wanted to leave that network, you had to buy a new phone. And the other thing they used to do was lock your number to them as a carrier. So if you want to switch networks, you'd have to send out that mass text to all your friends. Hey, got a new phone, got a new number. Here it is, to get them back in your contact list. And the same is happening right now with OCPP. Even though it's an open protocol, an alliance to standardize these communications across the industry, there are some manufacturers who still lock their hardware to the software. And if you ever want to switch hardware vendors, if you ever want to switch software vendors, you've got to switch the hardware, or vice versa. And what the new OCPP standard sets out to resolve, we're currently at 1.6, we're quickly moving to 2.0.1, and what it sets to resolve is that complicated, cumbersome nuisance of a scenario that Pauline Richards went through. The problem with the current OCPP protocol is it has super robust communication from the EVSE. You see it in the middle of this slide, super robust communication from the EVSE to the central system that controls it. So very robust. You get that whole protocol set that I briefly mentioned earlier. The problem with 1.6, you get very little communication from the actual vehicle to the EVSE, the charge point itself. The only thing you get across that J1772 control pilot pin is a voltage signal. And the voltage just means, hey, I'm charged, hey, I'm not charged, charge, don't charge. That's the only thing you're fundamentally getting from the vehicle itself, which means every time you want to initiate a transaction, you've got to do it at the charge point. And typically, to save cost and to have less downtime on chargers, manufacturers have chosen to do what you heard with Pauline, which is develop an app, put your credit card in there, and initiate the transaction on the cloud. That's why we need all these different apps to be able to drive an electric vehicle right now. But the whole industry is chasing the precedent that Tesla has set. Tesla builds the vehicles, they build the charge points, and they build the software that controls them. If you drive a Tesla right now and you pull up to a Tesla charger, the second you plug your connector in, it pulls your credit card information from your app and it bills you for that charging session. We call it plug and charge. That is the term. And OCPP 2.0.1 and the hardware and the software systems that are built to comply with it solve this problem, because the ISO, the International Standards Organization, have built a new standard called 15118, and it moves the communication, or moves our communication layer up a level into the vehicle. So now across that same J1772 connector on that control pilot, I no longer just get voltage, I can get a secure token. And that secure token can pass through the charge point and be authenticated on the back end. And what that practically means, what that means in the real world, is all of the other automotive manufacturers, the rest of the industry and the rest of the hardware manufacturers and the rest of the software vendors can offer that same plug and charge experience where the driver puts their credit card info in their vehicle's app. And then as soon as they plug into any OCP ISO 15118 compliant charge point that's communicating to a central system that's 2.0.1 compliant, it just starts the charging session. And this is where we need to get to as an industry to drive adoption a whole lot faster and solve the problems that the Pauline Richards of the world are having. Funding, I think this, from a sales perspective, is one of the lowest hanging fruit anyone in our industry has currently to go out and develop some business. I mentioned it at the start when I talked about what are some of the big drivers for this right now. And I talked about our federal government and the money they're investing into it. The program that we have in Canada currently that everyone should be aware of on this call, if they're in the industry, is the Zero Emission Vehicle Infrastructure Program. It's administered by Natural Resources Canada, and it's a large pot of money. It's almost $1 billion that's sitting in that pot, and that money is being redistributed to subsidize the cost to build out infrastructure in this country. To give you scope of how big it is, one project can receive up to $5 million in funding. They'll pay up to $5,000 or 50% for every level 2 charger you install. They'll pay up to $100,000 for every DC-FC charger you install. There's been 422, this has gone up, this data is a little bit old, but there's been roughly 500 projects funded to date. Around 40,000 chargers have been funded to date. But NRCan is saying we still need another 700 public chargers just to hit our 2030 targets that the government has set out for zero emission vehicle adoption. They're looking for roughly an 8-to-1 ratio. So for every 8 vehicles sold, we need 1 publicly available charger in this country to support it. We're sitting right now at about 12-to-1. So we got a long way to go. There's a huge amount of money to be spent. And this is something you can take to customers or industry and help them solve problems. Especially you look at things like apartment buildings, which have some of the greatest opportunities, fleet service, hotels. There's so many customers, universities, hospitals. There's so many customers who are probably on the fence right now about deploying infrastructure. They're seeing some demand. And if you add this carrot on top of it, which is a huge amount of funding and subsidies associated with it, it can really move projects across the finish line. So what is the market size? I know, this is an industry-specific presentation, and I really want to create some hype around the opportunity. And sometimes you just have to come down to the economics of it. If you look at Canada as a whole, you take all of the NRCan data, all of our federal government's commitments, and you look at really a 6.5-year projection right now. So if we look till 2030, and we only look at distributor pricing, and we look at fast charging, we look at software, we look at level 2 charging commercially, we look at level 2 charging for residential, single family, and you break it down by the market sectors, there's going to be $4.6 billion just spent on chargers and software. That doesn't include everything else distributors get to sell, like pipe, wire, breakers, switchgear, transformers. Everyone can kind of start to picture how much actual infrastructure is required on some of these deployments. This is just on the chargers and the software. $4.6 billion in the next 6.5 years is going to be spent. So a massive amount of opportunity is out there. And this is all net new business. I really like to highlight this. This is net new business, which means it's not like LED lighting where we took existing things like incandescents, fluorescence and we just replace them or cannibalize them with a better technology. This is all net new business for the electrical industry. This didn't exist prior to. And let's look at it by type. DCFC, I briefly mentioned this earlier, fast charging, because 90% of the time you charge at your destination and almost 100% of the time destination is a level 2 charger. DCFC, so fast charging, only represents 10% of charging, but look at its dollar value. It's almost $2 billion. Single family, these are the chargers, the home chargers, sub $1,000, or about $1 billion. Multi-unit residential building, 40% of Canadians don't own their home. 31% of Canadians live in a multi-unit residential building, so 3 units or up. Almost just over $1.1 billion spent there. Commercial charging, this includes fleet and a bunch of other opportunities for commercial, including workplace, including retail. You're looking at $500 million in the software component. I think this is really important for us to understand the industry. There's another layer to this technology, which is SaaS, or software as a service. And here's the percentage breakdown. I said it earlier. DCFC only represents 10% of all charging. It represents almost 40% of the cost to deploy infrastructure. If you were to go out and generate opportunities in your business as a distributor or wherever you land within the channel in our industry, here's where the opportunities are. 40% of the cost is going to be around fast charging. MERB is a big piece. Single family, of course, a little harder typically for us to play there because of the direct to consumer models, and then the commercial piece. And I'd also want a really great SaaS, or software as a service strategy, if I was a distributor. And I want to wrap this up by coming full circle. So where is this all going? I know this is an electrification story, and we primarily focused on electric vehicles, but I just want to end by wrapping everyone's head around the big picture of electrification, or what some people are calling greenification, the opportunities to get us to where we need to get to, which is GHG free by 2050. So one term is distributed energy resources. Electric vehicles are only a small piece, or they're not a small piece, but they're only a piece of the entire electrification which needs to occur in North America. If we're going to hit our zero emission goals, I just mentioned 2050, all the countries that signed the Paris climate deal, if they're going to get to GHG free by 2050, it's a lot more than just transportation we need to look at. In North America alone, only 19% of all consumed energy comes from the electrical grid. If we're going to hit our 2050 GHG targets, we need to go from 19% of consumed energy coming from the grid to 80%. If you look at steel manufacturing, you look at concrete production, you look at space heating systems, if you look at where all our GHG comes from, we need to go from 19% of all consumed energy coming from the grid to 80%. If you showed Alexander Graham Bell a modern day cell phone, what do you think he would say? He would say, I have no clue what that is, because the phone looks nothing like nothing he left. The telephony system looks nothing like he left. If you showed Edison, Westinghouse, and Tesla our current electrical grid, you know what they would say? It looks exactly like I left it. Not much has changed on the North American electrical grid in 100+ years. So we've got a long way to go to get from 19 to 80. The good news is we don't need that much more energy to electrify the entire transportation system of North America. Our grid's capacity was built for the worst case. Our grid's capacity was built for Christmas Day, Thanksgiving Day, those holidays in the middle of the winter when everyone's home, the lights are on, the heat's on, you're cooking, you're doing laundry. If you turned on every peaker plant or peak demand response plant, so you maxed out the production capacity today of the North American grid, we only need about 15% more energy to electrify the entire transportation system. The problem is math and reality don't always line up. I don't know if anyone remembers this story. It was one of my favorites since I've been in this industry, but this is August 24th of last year. This is the New York Times. California to ban the sale of new gasoline cars. California was the first state to legislate that you could not purchase an internal combustion engine by 2035. So a lot of people had set, guidelines, goals, things like that. California was the first state to legislate. That was August 24th. Let's go 1 week later. This is the same New York Times. Amid heat wave, California asked electric vehicle owners to limit the charging. There's 1.13 million EVs in the state of California. Friday previous week, they said, hey, we're banning combustion. A week later, they said, please don't plug in your electric vehicle. But here's what's interesting about the numbers. If you look at that grid event that occurred during that heat wave, a couple things that stand out to me. One, of the 1.13 million EV owners in the state of California, many of them play in a pilot demand response program where they'll get a notification on their phone that says, hey, we're having a grid event. If you allow us to delay the charging on your vehicle, we'll sell you the power at a reduced rate. And it's similar to giving up your seat on an airline. We'll start at 80% off per kilowatt hour, 50, 40, until they get enough buy-in that they've reduced or helped to reduce that peak demand event. When EV drivers who play in that program got the notification, less than 10% opted in because it compounded the problem. They said, oh my God, there's a grid event going on. I don't want to lose the energy or potential stored energy in my EV. So most of them plugged in and compounded the issue. At the time the grid peaked, it was at 52,000 megawatts that day in the state of California. If you took the combined stored energy in all of the vehicles, the 1.13 million vehicles in the state of California, over 28,000 megawatts was sitting inaccessible. Grid peaked at 52,000, more than half of the energy needed on the grid in that moment was sitting in stored vehicles. And this is where electrification is going long term. This is a shot right from Ford's website. For anyone who knows the Ford Lightning, it's the first vehicle I know where not only the advertising bidirectional, what's being coined bidirectional charging, they'll also sell you a charger, an inverter, and a transfer system to pull the power out of your battery and use it in two ways. They call it V to X because it can be vehicle to home, so as a backup source, or V to G, vehicle to grid, to address that situation that I just referenced in the state of California. So that's one piece to this electrification process for us in this industry. The other one I'm very excited about is what's well known now as the microgrid. This is a theoretical product you see on the side of this house called Block Energy. It has a DC grid interface. So the homes in this microgrid community would interface to each other DC to DC, all underground, no AC connection. It has integrated battery storage, 10, 20, 30 kilowatt hours of battery storage. It has a solar input, a direct DC, because now we're not getting into inverter losses. The whole system works off DC. It's got a DC solar input. It's got a DC V to G input for that vehicle that we just looked at, or a vehicle like it. And it also has supplementary generator input. So worst case, there's not enough energy in the entire microgrid. You could still plug in a traditional generator as an alternate source. But the best thing about this theoretical technology is it's not theoretical. It's actually an Emera company. For anyone in Atlantic Canada or nationally who knows Emera, they're a utility based out of Halifax, and they have another utility down in Tampa, Florida. And this is an actual community. This is an actual product. This is a shot of that community. The interesting thing for me is in this business model, the utility owns everything. So when the homeowners bought these homes, they paid no more for the home. They pay the same price as everybody else in that utility pays per kilowatt hour. Emera owns the solar on the roof. They own the DC storage on the side of the house. They own every facet of that energy system. All of these homes are interconnected through DC. So if you've underproduced or you're over consuming, you need power, you can pull from any one of your neighbors. This is all managed by the utility. They also installed what they call a block central system, which has additional supplementary storage, additional solar generation, additional backup generator, and then you have a utility connection. So if the community's overproducing energy, Emera can dump that back onto their grid and sell it where they see fit. The beautiful thing for the homeowner is they get this incredible GHG-free, robust network. We all in Nova Scotia, at least, and New Brunswick too, saw the grid outages that just occurred for the last tropical storm, not even a hurricane, last tropical storm or tropical depression rolled through. They don't worry about any of this because they've got their own storage on site. Everything's underground. It's incredibly robust. So perfect experience for the homeowner. And then for the utility, they didn't have to build more macro generation because I assure you, if you look at the environmental impacts, if you look at the cost per kilowatt, no utility in North America wants to produce or build any more macro generating stations. And I just want to end here. I started with our industry, where we're currently at, and I just wanted to finish and give perspective to the massive opportunities in front of us. I'm extremely excited about it. I hope everybody else is as well. And I thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark, for that insightful presentation. Lots of things to unpack there, I'm sure. Right now, we're going to open up the question and answer session. Just as you were speaking, Mark, I know a few things have been in the news concerning hydrogen. So I know in Alberta, their premier there is really pushing the idea of, I'll get into a hydrogen car as zero emission fuel, not a battery electric car. So can you maybe expand a little bit on, is battery electric better in that scenario, or does the premier there have a point with hydrogen as being more attractive?
Yeah, that's a great one. And it's interesting too, because if you look, as much as maybe I make it sound like electric vehicles, it's actually zero emission vehicles. So our government is still trying to be open to multiple technology platforms. Really, if you check that zero emission box, you're approved for most of these subsidies and programs and infrastructures. I'll just speak from a user experience. We talk about the Tesla, we talked about the advent of technology. Just from a user experience, as someone who's been an EV driver for years, never having to stop to refuel is a pretty awesome experience. They call it the 3 seconds a day. So you come home at night, you plug in for 3 seconds, and that's really all the charging I have to do. I have a charger at my house, and for me, it's like 99% of the time I come home and charge. If you were to give me the option, hey, you have 2 zero emission vehicles, this one's battery, this one's hydrogen, what user experience do you want? Even if everything was apples to apples, which maybe someday it will be, we saw the performance gains going on right now with electric vehicles. I still think, at least for light duty, electric vehicles are probably going to be a better user experience, and ultimately consumers, I think, will drive what technology they prefer. I think hydrogen, when you look at some other applications, heavy duty vehicles, some of those charging standards they're trying to develop around the megawatt systems look pretty astronomical. So maybe they'll coexist for different applications, but I'm definitely biased based on what I just told you as a driver with my experience.
Interesting. Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, any questions that anyone has, please use that chat window. And we have a few minutes left here to answer those questions. I know you mentioned a lot about, change throughout your presentation, Mark, the different types of adapters, or not adapters, but chargers. As the technology continues to change and progress, as you mentioned, I guess, how can we, as a potential buyer of an electric vehicle, be assured that, my charger will stay current, or do I need to upgrade that within a year or two? Or, I'm just wondering about when, if I decide to pull the trigger, how would that affect me down the road?
Yeah, that's one we get commonly, especially from people deploying large amounts of infrastructure. You look at an apartment building developer, even in our local market here, which is small relative to some big markets in Canada, if you've got 1,000 doors under management and you're doing 10% of your portfolio, that could be 100 chargers. That's a big investment. The nice thing, at least about level 2 charging technology, we've seen more, a higher rate of change when it comes to DC-FC, because the power levels keep going up and up and up. At least with level 2, which I mentioned, which is AC into the vehicle, the car is really doing all the work there. So there's less concern, in my opinion, and others, around, ultimately 48 amps at 240 volts is always going to be 10 kilowatts. What the car chooses or how much battery is in the car, that's not really going to change. And the level 2 stuff is primarily capped by the service size on the building. So even if there was faster, bigger, you're still dealing with ultimately what the grid can handle, what the building service can handle. So the limitations there typically would keep trepidation down on my part, or from a concern standpoint, because you're like, okay, there's not much more we can do with this building's capacity anyway.
Great. We'll just go to perhaps one more that I had here, just kind of, related to the life cycle, the long-term life cycle of batteries. I know we hear a little bit in the news about, where the materials come from, and that it might be, not infinite, but it is more finite. And so we have to be very aware of the environmental impacts. I guess, how do you see that unfolding as technology advances with batteries? Will it be taking more, minerals, or have a greater environmental impact as the batteries get more efficient?
Yeah, the environmental footprint is one that probably still needs a lot more clarity. Even with organizations that have been funded by big oil and gas coming up with what probably is the worst case scenario, even going to the vehicle itself, not just the batteries, going to the vehicle themselves, even electric vehicle that is 100% charged on the dirtiest coal-fired grid in North America still pollutes less cradle to grave than its combustion counterpart. So that's the worst case scenario. Of course, the grid, we're doing everything we can to get it cleaner. On the batteries, I'm, a big free market economist, in the sense that I think once there's a great business case there, just like we've seen with Tesla and EVs themselves, once there's a great business case to recycle these, and I know that is a focus at the federal level, at the environmental level, okay, what are we going to do with these batteries and recycling? We're hearing, similar to other technology hype curves I talked about earlier, we're hearing some hype around, 90, 95% recyclable batteries now. So I think it will come with time once the business case is there. We're just so early into the technology. These are kind of future problems. We got to get one behind us, maybe before the industry starts looking at the next.
Interesting. Great. Lots of great points here, Mark. Thanks so much again for taking the time. And thank you to everyone else out there for joining us. This concludes our program today. If you would like more information on our upcoming events happening at EFC, or would like to know more information about our Young Professionals Network, the YPN, please visit our website at electrofed.com. We have a few events that are coming up here for EFC, leading, of course, into the end of the year. So if you can come out and attend and participate, we'd love to have you. But that concludes our program today. Thank you again so much for attending. Thank you, Mark. And we hope to see everyone at one of our future events very, very soon. Have a great day. Take care.
Thanks.